We gather as a community each year at this time, the birthday of Robert E. Lee, by charge of the Board of Trustees, to remember the individual who profoundly shaped the institution that now bears his name. The thematic purpose of this remembrance has appropriately broadened over time. It is now an occasion to remind ourselves of one of our most enduring legacies, leadership and its centrality to the Washington and Lee University mission. And not just leadership, but a particular kind of leadership, one with integrity, honor, and service to others as defining qualities. For that reason and others, we also recognize the new members of Omicron Delta Kappa, the National Leadership and Scholarship Honor Society. Founded at Washington and Lee 98 years ago, it now has circles at over 300 colleges and universities, and of course its national headquarters here in Lexington, Virginia. And let me also note, just as a quick aside for those of you who, on the same theme, have seen the front page of the Richmond Times today and the video that is on our website of Senator John Warner at yesterday's Virginia Assembly honoring Delegate Lacey Putney, the longest-serving delegate in the Commonwealth of Virginia's history. It's an ode to Washington and Lee and the values of honor and leadership that those two alumni have represented throughout their career. Directly up the hill from where we sit this morning is Washington Hall. Over the years, it has become known as a kind of administration building, or as some might have unkindly said, an administration dumping ground, perfumed by a classroom or two and maybe the offices of an academic department. When we move back into it a year from now, at the completion of its restoration, it will be truly Washington Hall, the place where the story of George Washington's connection to this university is on full display. The foyer will have exhibits, and the new benefactors wall will call attention to those who, like Washington, bestowed upon the university the gift of their philanthropy, a sign of their faith and confidence in our mission. Without George Washington's donation of James River Canal stock, about 20,000, which in today's dollars is roughly the equivalent of a lot more, this university would not exist today. Or if it did, going under the name of either Augusta Academy or Liberty Hall Academy would be far less impressive than Washington and Lee University. On the surface, the reasons for Washington's gift were straightforward. He wanted to promote higher learning in the western frontier of the country, which is where we were at the time, and, as he said in his letter of transmittal, to promote literature in this rising empire and to encourage the arts have ever been among the warmest wishes of my heart. The story was more complicated, however. The stock had been given to him in the first instance in recognition of his public service. But as a man of honor, he did not feel he could profit from doing his duty, while his sense of propriety made him reluctant to reject the gift and offend those who wished to honor him. So Washington had a problem. With his virtues in conflict, he could neither accept the money nor give it back. And we were happy to be of assistance. Now, I mentioned the story for obvious self-serving institutional reasons, but also to provide some insight into Washington's character. Nowhere is that profile better presented than Ron Chernow's elegantly written biography, the book that won last year's Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. It is a masterpiece of history and biography for so many reasons, but there is one that especially comes to mind as I reflect upon some of the ways history has entered our conversations these past couple of weeks. These days, not just here, but throughout society, we have a tendency to caricature our historical figures as heroes or villains. I worry about our modern-day reflex to attack or defend rather than understand. Our passionate attachments or animosities forged in the partisanship of the day, distort our ability to assess individuals and their times soberly. We are free to judge history, of course, but only if we confront it in all its complexity and not selectively mine it for debating points in modern conflicts. We should honor and respect the past, but not worship it. History is history, the study of imperfect people in imperfect times. We can find religion elsewhere. The study of history, properly done, should guide us, not blind us. It should broaden our vision of the future, not narrow it. When Joseph Ellis wrote American Sphinx in his study of Thomas Jefferson, he ran into a problem. His youthful fascination with Jefferson gave way to a mature appraisal. In the midst of the contemporary attacks and counterattacks on Jefferson, Ellis found it difficult, in his words, to steer an honorable course between idolatry and evisceration. In the end, he concluded that affection for and criticism of Jefferson were not mutually exclusive postures. Mr. Chernow's book portrays Washington as a human being, full of virtue, but not always above the political fray, a truly admirable and remarkable man, but not a perfect one. Chernow's own honorable course between idolatry and evisceration is neither a vilification nor a deification of a great historical figure. It is a respectful, careful, and wonderfully written portrait of a man and the incredibly challenging time in which he lived. It is a model of how to do history. This is probably the appropriate time to note that autographed copies of his book will be available in the bookstore after them. And they will be. An honors graduate of Yale and Cambridge, Ron Chernow is one of the most distinguished commentators on politics, business, and finance in America today. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch has hailed him as one of the preeminent biographers of his generation. His first book, The House of Morgan, won the National Book Award as the best nonfiction book of 1990 and is considered a modern classic. The Modern Library Board voted it one of the 100 best nonfiction books published in the 20th century. His second book, The Warburgs, won the prestigious George S. Eccles Prize for the best business book of 1993 and was cited by the American Library Association as one of the year's 10 best works. His 1998 biography of John D. Rockefeller, Titan, was nominated for a National Book Critics Circle Award for biography and remained on the New York Times bestseller list for 16 weeks. Both the Times and Time magazine voted it one of the 10 best books of the year, while the Times of London praised it as one of the great American biographies. Mr. Chernow's much anticipated biography of Alexander Hamilton was published by the Penguin Press in April 2004 to extraordinary acclaim. The New York Times called it moving and masterly, by far the best biography ever written about the man. In October 2010, the Penguin Press published Mr. Chernow's biography of George Washington, Washington, A Life. The book was also a New York Times bestseller and won both the prestigious American History Book Prize and, as I mentioned, the Pulitzer Prize for nonfiction. Please join me in welcoming Ron Chernow.
Thank you, President Ruscio, for that extraordinarily gracious and generous introduction. I can't tell you what a distinct pleasure and honor it is to participate in the Founders Day ODK Convocation for a university named, at least in part, after George Washington. And I didn't think that I would have the additional thrill of delivering this speech seated directly next to really one of the most famous paintings of Washington. It's the Charles Wilson Peel. It was done in 1772. Washington was 40 years old. It's the earliest known picture of Washington. Washington later said that when he sat for the painting for Peel that he felt sullen and gloomy and often sleepy, but he was so pleased with the result that this painting hung in the place of honor in Washington's parlor at Mount Vernon for the rest of his life. Gives you some idea of just how attached he was to this glorious picture. Now, in February 1789, in other words, right before Washington was inaugurated as our first president, he received a fascinating letter from Europe written by his close friend, Gouverneur Morris. It reported on the sudden madness of King George III. You may have seen the film of that title. In the king's delirious state, wrote Morris, he had, quote, conceived himself to be no less a personage than George Washington marching at the head of the American army. Then Morris added facetiously, this delusion shows that you have done something or other which sticks most terribly in the king's stomach. Indeed, Washington had. But who was this commoner George, who had become such a legendary figure in his own time, that he actually managed to invade the feverish dream world of the deranged royal George? Well, I first grew interested in this question about 10 years ago. I was researching my Hamilton biography, and there came a moment late in the Revolutionary War where Washington and Hamilton had a quarrel. Hamilton quit Washington's staff where he had been aide-de-camp, and Hamilton knew that he had to defend this rather controversial decision to family and friends. And so he sat down and he wrote a series of letters in which he portrayed George Washington as moody, irritable, and temperamental, even, dare I say, something of a powder keg boss. As Hamilton informed his father-in-law, with certainly more than a touch of youthful bravado, quote, the great man and I have come to an open rupture. He shall for once at least repent his ill humor. Well, I can remember sitting there, ill humor? Did Hamilton mean to imply that the saintly father of our country was this sulky, carping, often volatile boss? Now, this was far from the whole truth about George Washington, and in my book, I hope I devote sufficient and lavish praise to Washington's fortitude, his patience, his integrity, his wisdom, his patriotism, and 1,000 other outstanding traits. My intention as biographer was not to debunk George Washington. In fact, what I was trying to do was to recreate the charisma and the magnetism that had so excited Washington's contemporaries, but that had somehow gotten lost in the translation to posterity. Nevertheless, Hamilton tended to pen very perceptive word portraits of people, and his comments for me opened up an unexpected window into a world of seething emotions swirling around inside George Washington. Of course, emotions that he had learned to keep in check with his very formidable self-control. And what I slowly came to realize was that Washington was not this bland figure, worthy but dull, who was somehow taken up residence in the American imagination. Let's face it, revolutionaries are not made of such tame stuff. And I began to feel, however implausibly, that George Washington, seemingly the most familiar figure in American history, was perhaps, at bottom, the most unfamiliar. And I began to wonder, as biographers are wont to do, whether there were other significant dimensions of his personality that had been overlooked by my predecessors, dimensions that would not only help me to bring Washington to a very vivid, three-dimensional life, but that would make his narrative far more credible to the reader. So I decided to perpetrate yet another Washington biography on an unsuspecting world, even though there had been 900 previous Washington biographies. It takes a certain amount of chutzpah to do that. Well, after 6 years of painstaking work on this book, I can tell you that George Washington turned out to be a passionate, complex, sensitive man, a man of many moods, a man of often fiery opinions. He was a fierce, hard-driving perfectionist who had learned to cloak the immense force of his personality behind this laconic and stoic facade that we know so well. You see, I think that what's happened over the years in our perfectly laudable desire to venerate the father of our country, we've sanded down the rough edges of his personality, and we've turned him into this impossibly stiff and lifeless figure, much like, you know, the famous Gilbert Stuart portrait that hangs in the East Room of the White House, where you see Washington standing there with his arm rigidly thrust forward. Well, that wooden character could never have defeated the British Empire, after all, which had the mightiest military machine of the 18th century. That wooden character could never have presided over the often fractious Constitutional Convention, nor could that wooden figure have forged the office of the presidency. The man who did all that, I think it stands to common sense and reason, was a real force of nature, although that force was, again, carefully kept hidden from the outside world. Now, unfortunately, in order to fashion a brand new portrait of Washington, the poor biographer must begin by hacking his way with a very sharp machete through a very dense jungle of misconceptions that have grown up around the man. I've discovered even well-educated Americans find it difficult to clear their minds of the many myths that cling to Washington's memory. So, if you may, let me start out by retiring some of the most egregious errors about the man, however trivial they may seem at first glance to this highly educated audience. The cherry tree story, let's get that out of the way right off the bat, was pure invention. It was fabricated after Washington's death by a man named Parson Mason Locke Weems, who was an itinerant preacher and bookseller, obviously with an eye on the main chance. There was a tremendous market for Washington stories after he died. This fictitious story has been very unfortunate. For one thing, it has been used to terrorize generations of American school children. We've all had, you know, that story thrust in our face at age 4 or 5. It also has created, as we'll see, a very misleading image of George Washington as a cold and priggish figure when, in fact, he was anything but. Another common myth, the wooden teeth. This is very puzzling, since obviously wood would rot in the mouth in a matter of days or weeks. By the time Washington became president, he had only a single tooth left in his mouth. It was an extremely brave and very, very lonely lower left bicuspid. Both his upper and lower dentures were both anchored onto that one poor tooth. I examined one set of the dentures at the New York Academy of Medicine Library in New York, and let me tell you, they were really ungainly, medieval-looking contraptions, painful to examine. I can only imagine how painful to wear they would have been, rubbing relentlessly against his raw gums. They were carved not from wood, but from walrus or elephant ivory, and they had human teeth inserted in them. He may actually have bought from his own slaves. This sounds rather ghoulish. It wasn't. It was standard practice in the 18th century to buy teeth from people. Well, as that ivory aged and stained, it developed a grainy look that to later generations resembled wood. Hence the historic misunderstanding that neither I nor any of my predecessors can seem to banish. You know, you develop a healthy respect as a historian for the power of legend. Legend seems to be much more powerful than a fact, alas. When I was examining the dentures, I did find one thing that must have had a very direct impact on Washington's presidency. You see, the upper and lower dentures were connected in the back by curved metal springs. What that meant was that the only way that General Washington could keep them, or President Washington could keep them in his mouth, was to keep his lips firmly compressed. It meant that every time he opened his mouth to speak, the pressure would relax on the springs, and there was always the distinct possibility that the presidential dentures, yes, would come flying out of the presidential mouth. Now, it may or may not be coincidental that the many speeches Washington gave as president were often only 1, 2, or 3 paragraphs long. Another Washington myth is that he wore a wig. I never came across a single instance where he did. So how did he get that strange hairdo? Well, he pulled his hair back in a style that we would call a ponytail, known as a queue in the 18th century. I don't know exactly how he got the hair to stand out horizontally on the sides. And then he sprinkled gray powder on his hair. You can actually see, not in this portrait, but in some of the later portraits, you could see a fine grayish dust on his shoulders. It wasn't dandruff, that was the hair powder that had sprinkled down onto his shoulders. Now, to modernize this hairstyle looks suspiciously like a wig and very genteel. But in the 18th century, if someone had seen Washington walking down the street with that, as we would say, ponytail, and didn't know who he was, if that was possible, they would know from the hairstyle, there goes a general officer. That was actually considered the manly and military look. Finally, some of these things seem trivial and kind of give you a sense of how his biographer builds up a portrait that's actually based on fact. Everyone repeats ad nauseum that George Washington was 6'2", 6'3", 6'3½". Why? It all rests on a single piece of evidence. When after he died, he was measured for the coffin, the cadaver measured exactly 6'3½". That would seem to settle the matter, right? Okay, I want you, when you go home tonight, get into bed, lie down on your back, and just relax. You'll find that what happens, your feet will fall forward, your toes will point outward. It adds about 2 or 3 inches to your height. Add in rigor mortis, suddenly Washington is 6'3". I collected nearly 40 comments from Washington's contemporaries who had referred to his height. In about 35 cases, they said that he was exactly 6 feet tall. But then there came the clincher, biographer's gold. Every 6 months before the Revolutionary War, Washington, like all of the Virginia planters, Washington ordered his clothes from London. He would write very detailed letters to his London tailor, and he always described himself, yes, as a man exactly 6 feet tall. Now, we all know the one person you can't lie to about your height, unless you want to end up looking like a laughingstock, is your London tailor. So I think we can consider the case closed. He was 6'2", which was tall at the time, although Jefferson, I think, was about 6 foot. Washington was about 6 feet. I think Jefferson was about 6'2". I always think readers of biography can be divided into 2 groups. There's those people who can't wait to arrive at the moment when the historical personage arrives in the narrative. And then there are people who are interested in that struggling, obscure, groping young person who is looking to find his or her identity. And I think Washington's story is particularly interesting in terms of how he becomes Washington. We associate him with the Revolutionary War, but he was already something of a prodigy when he was in his 20s. And I should tell you, Washington had relatively little formal schooling. He never went to university. Almost all of the other founders did. Hamilton went to what became Columbia. Madison went to what became Princeton. John Adams went to Harvard, etc. Washington didn't, much to his regret, go to university. He often referred to his defective education. It created a certain underlying insecurity and anxiety in his life, and I have absolutely no doubt that it's one of the reasons that he endowed this school as well as other educational institutions. Now, because he wasn't in university in his early 20s, he spent 5 years fighting in the French and Indian War, which is probably maybe for the best in terms of subsequent history. By the age of 23, Washington, really a wunderkind, commanded all of the armed forces in Virginia at a time when Virginia was, of course, the most powerful and populous colony. His perseverance, his bravery were already the stuff of legend. There was one famous battle on the Monongahela where Washington absorbed 4 bullets in his hat and coat. He had 2 horses shot from under him. Miraculously, he walks away unscathed from the battlefield. In fact, this led one Presbyterian minister to preach a sermon in which he said the heroic youth, Colonel Washington, was clearly being preserved by Providence for some important service to his country. I think we could say one of the better calls in sermon history, that. But this young Washington was not yet the wise paragon of later years. He could be crass and dogged as he pursued money, status, and power. In fact, he first rebels against the British Empire, not for idealistic reasons, but really, I think, for personal reasons. The British had denied him the royal commission in the regular army that he coveted. The British sold his tobacco for what he considered inferior prices in London, and then they had the nerve to turn around and sell him in exchange what he saw as shoddy and overpriced goods. They banned settlements near or west of the Allegheny Mountains just when George Washington was starting to amass land there. The British for the young Washington. They were simply bad for business. They were bad for your career. And I think that in studying, the early years of Washington's life, you don't yet feel that you're in the company of historic greatness, even though Washington had many admirable traits, courage, fortitude, that foreshadow wondrous things to come. I think it's safe to say the bane of his early years was not that distant Royal George, but someone far more formidable and much, much closer to home. I mean, of course, his mother, Mary Ball Washington. Now, Washington's father, Gus, died when George was 11, leaving him to the tender mercies of his mother, and Mary Washington was, not to put too fine a point on it, something of a holy terror. She was a very self-centered, difficult, domineering woman. She'd been left a widow with 6 children. She felt that George, as the youngest son, should always be there to take care of her. She took no apparent pride or pleasure in his career, even though, safe to say, she had more to boast about than any other mother in American history. We have no evidence that she attended the wedding of George and Martha Washington. No evidence that she ever visited them at Mount Vernon, even though it was not very far from her home in Fredericksburg. Historic rumor has even tagged Mary Washington as a possible Tory during the Revolutionary War. Now, she always felt, as I said, that George was abandoning her in favor of his career. During the French and Indian War, this is one of my favorite letters, she wrote George a letter saying that she urgently needed a new Dutch servant and some butter, as if George, who then had 1,000 men under his command, was supposed to drop all of his regimental duties and go fetch his mother some butter. Later in the war, much less comically, Washington learned that Mary had popped up in Richmond, the state capital, asking for emergency relief. She claimed poverty, and she hinted at neglect and abandonment by you-know-who. Nobody in the Virginia legislature had the courage for a full 2 months to inform Washington about this episode and that his mother had been there lobbying, and Washington was understandably livid. When he learned about it, he had been extraordinarily generous with her financially. Next time you're in Fredericksburg, stop by and see that beautiful house on a downtown corner that Washington had bought for his mother. In my book, I speculate that the first great general George Washington ever encountered was his own mother, Cornwallis. Cornwallis was nothing in comparison. And that he first learned to govern his considerable temper in dealing with her strange and invariably capricious moods. Now, with such a mother, and I said a father who died when George was 11, it's no wonder that he doesn't start out as a saint. He simply is very capable and ambitious. But then in the mid-1760s, with the Stamp Act and the Townsend duties, something miraculous begins to happen in this life. Washington realizes that his private grievances simply reflect a larger public problem, and that the cards have been stacked against all of the colonists. And his personal frustrations, these long simmering frustrations, are suddenly and rather gloriously transformed into universal principles of justice. And it's then that George Washington begins to find his own political voice. And make no mistake about it, that voice was a strong and militant one. If ever there was a man who was fired up by a righteous cause, who was ennobled by circumstances, that was George Washington, who managed to transcend his origins in a way that I think has few, if any, parallels in our history. Perhaps only Abraham Lincoln grew in stature so much during his lifetime. We all know 2 moments in the Revolutionary War: Washington crossing the Delaware and the dreary winter at Valley Forge. Both episodes can be a little misleading. Of course, Washington deserves full credit for his daring in crossing the Delaware on Christmas night and surprising those drowsing Hessians at Trenton. Has to be said, though, he was only a middling general. He actually lost more battles than he won. This is not the saga of a Wellington or a Napoleon. Yet I don't think that you can judge George Washington by the usual scorecard of battles lost and won. I think this is one of those rare cases in history where what happens between battles is arguably more important than what happens on the battlefield, because by strength of will, by tenacity of purpose, by force of character, by clarity of vision, George Washington single-handedly holds the American army and hence the American cause, and hence the American nation together. And he manages to do this despite constant nerve-wracking shortages of money, manpower, weapons, blankets, clothing, shoes, gunpowder, you name it. Valley Forge was admittedly bleak, but if you know the story, there were other winters during the Revolutionary War that were perhaps just as bleak, if less honored, in our national mythology. Washington possessed the most extraordinary gifts of leadership, which of course makes him a perfect topic for this ODK initiation ceremony. And these are gifts of leadership that I fear are sorely lacking among our politicians today. During the war, for instance, Washington knew how to motivate his soldiers by making them see themselves as actors in a grand historical pageant, this glorious fight for freedom. I think that really in history only Winston Churchill did that better. Washington made the lowliest grunt feel that his sacrifice mattered. At the same time, he never assumed that people were saints, and he regularly issued orders before battles warning that any soldiers who deserted would be shot dead on the spot. So he didn't trust completely to idealism. Washington always made people strive to match up to his impossibly high standards. He never confused leadership with a popularity contest. This is not someone either as a general or as a president who pandered or cut corners. He thought that a leader should strive to be respected, not liked. He's saying this already in his 20s. But the irony, of course, is that he became so respected that he became not only liked but also loved. I think nobody else but Washington would have had the courage and fortitude to endure 8 years of unspeakable misery as he struggled to keep this small, threadbare army intact. If you doubt that there's at least a grain of truth in the great man or great woman theory of history, read Washington's story and try to figure out who else might have stepped into his shoes. Other generals there were who may have been superior in terms of tactics or strategy, but you see they're all sidetracked by petty bickering, they're all jockeying for power. Only Washington has what I would call the inspired simplicity, the determination to see the job through. He always kept his eye on the ball. He was a very complicated man. In some ways, Washington was a very enigmatic man. But when it came to these supreme quests that defined his life, he had a focus and a drive and discipline that were truly unique. Give George Washington a task and he would fulfill it. And whatever his deficiencies as a general, this man was a genius as a politician, peerless as a vote-getter in American history. Okay, consider this stunning record. Washington is unanimously elected commander-in-chief in Philadelphia in June 1775. He's unanimously elected president of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787. And then he's elected president not once, but twice by unanimous votes of the Electoral College. In this, mind you, he does without a single focus group or pollster or political action committee giving him any advice. This was just his own political intuitions. Washington, I think, amasses unprecedented power because he doesn't seem to be grasping for it. People trust him not to abuse power. In fact, he often seemed burdened by the weight of his own celebrity. Of course, what happened, the more reluctant he appeared to come out of retirement and lead the country anew, the more the country clamored to have him back. His presence in Philadelphia in 1787, I think, was absolutely vital. Remember, the Constitutional Convention was held behind closed doors. Even Madison's notes were not published until decades later. And Washington's position at the helm reassures a potentially skittish public that no nefarious plot is being hatched inside. There was a widespread assumption, of course, that Washington would be the first president, and this emboldened the delegates to create a powerful office of the presidency despite their very understandable fears of a reversion to monarchy. Remember, we had just fought a war against the excesses of executive power. Washington really shaped the office of the presidency, and we live with his legacy to this day. Let me explain what I mean. The delegates at Philadelphia hoped and expected that Congress would be the preeminent branch of government. It's the reason why Article I deals with Congress and a long list of enumerated powers. Article II, which deals with the presidency, is perhaps by design deliberately short and vague. Now, Washington, during 8.5 years of war, had dealt with this squabbling, ramshackle Congress. He had no illusions about legislative leadership. He knew that only the president could spearhead domestic and foreign policy, and that in this very complicated machinery that we created of separation of powers, that it would be the executive branch that would, and checks and balances, I'm sorry, it would be the executive branch that would be the engine of government. This is something that we nowadays take for granted, but it was really George Washington's legacy. Had it not been for Washington, we might have ended up with something indeed closer to a parliamentary democracy. Washington also creates a cabinet. In the Constitution, there is only a passing reference to reports by departmental heads, and Washington sets a benchmark for brilliant appointees that has never been matched. Okay, he names Alexander Hamilton, Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Knox, Secretary of War, and Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State. Pound for pound, by far the best cabinet we will ever have, right? American all-star team. Like all great executives, Washington never hesitated to hire people who were smarter than he did, and he felt fully confident that he could control his team of headstrong prima donnas, which he mostly did, although sometimes with difficulty, particularly, as you know, when Hamilton and Jefferson started feuding with each other, and even Washington at times felt powerless. Washington established, so many enduring precedents of the presidency that we can take his gigantic influence for granted. I mean, take the matter of presidential inaugurations. Only says in the Constitution the president has to take the oath of office. Washington decides that the occasion should be an open-air ceremony before a multitude of citizens. Washington decides that the president should deliver a broadly thematic inaugural address, not a long list of policy specifics, and it's Washington who decides that the president should place his hand on a Bible as he takes the oath of office. A fierce debate still rages as to whether or not he really said "so help me God" after kissing the Bible, a detail not reported until 60 years after the fact, but the mere presumption that Washington did it has led every president since then to say the words. Now, believe it or not, when Washington became president, he expected to serve for only a year or two, establish the legitimacy of the office, and then step down. But one crisis after another intervened. His cabinet would say, "You can't leave now, we're in the middle of a crisis," and he ends up staying for full 2 terms. He could have stayed as long as he wanted, whatever the criticism of him. He initiated a custom that was followed by all presidents, of course, until FDR was elected 4 times, the 3rd and 4th time, under conditions of wartime emergency. But that precedent was so powerful of Washington having served 2 terms and stepped down that after the Second World War, the 22nd Amendment was enacted that made the legal limit of 2 terms. Now, I know at the moment we're all feeling rather disillusioned with our political leadership, whatever our political affiliations, and we gaze back nostalgically to the founding era as the golden age of brilliant and erudite statesmen. The founders, though, were very opinionated and argumentative people. They took keen pleasure in attacking each other, and frankly, they seldom agreed about anything. People always say to me, "What would the founders have thought?" And I said that they didn't agree about anything. Let me just give you the flavor of the founders on other founders. John Adams said that Hamilton was the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. Hamilton, who gave as good as he got, said of Adams, "The man is more mad than ever I thought him, and I shall soon be led to say as wicked as he is mad." Adams was very good at this invective. He said of Benjamin Franklin, quote, "His whole life has been one continued insult to good manners and to decency." Franklin, not surprisingly, was happy to return the favor. Franklin said famously about Adams, quote, "He means well for his country, is always an honest man, often a wise man, but sometimes, and in some things, absolutely out of his senses." If the founders were alive today, I think they'd be less surprised by all the partisan venom. They were pretty good in that department themselves. I think they would be surprised by the mediocre caliber of so many of our public servants. It's really only Washington who rises rather magnificently above this name-calling. It again shows that extraordinary clarity of vision that had made him the ideal wartime leader. But even Washington did not escape unscathed in this poisonous political atmosphere of the 1790s. The opposition press accused President Washington of everything from plotting to restore the British monarchy to, yes, having been a British double agent throughout the entire Revolutionary War. Rather preposterous, the idea that the chief of the victorious Continental Army had been in the pay of British gold. Had this been the case, the British must have felt they got a very poor return on their investment after Yorktown. Huh? Now, one of many surprises for me in studying the life of Washington was how beleaguered he felt by his own fame. Here's a young man craved fame and recognition. He gets much more than any human being could possibly want. Washington was not a natural politician to the extent that he was a man of innate dignity. This was not a, backslapping, glad-handing politician. And nowadays we think of a politician as somebody who can get up, spur of the moment, tell a funny anecdote, say a few well-chosen words. This wasn't George Washington at all. He lacked the gift of spontaneity. He lacked the gift of gab. So he was oppressed by this incessant attention that he received. Now, during his first term in office, he made a very wise decision. He decided he would travel first to all the northern states, then all the southern states, so that everyone could see him. And it was a wonderful idea. It was a very democratic and egalitarian idea. But what happened, every day he would arrive at a different town, and there would always be an escort of dignitaries who would meet him on the outskirts of town and accompany him into town. It always became a parade. So Washington, you could see in his diary, he would say, the dignitaries were supposed to meet me on the outskirts of town at 5 p.m. I deliberately arrived at 3 p.m. in order to avoid them. Or he would write in his diary, the next day, they were supposed to escort me outside of town at 8 a.m. I set my alarm early and had left town by 5 a.m. He's constantly, evading these, incessant social occasion. I was also very amused to learn in the 18th century that the aphrodisiac of power operated in full force wherever Washington went on those two tours. He recorded the exact number of fashionable women in the town in attendance. He would write, for instance, arrived in New Haven today, there was a ball in my honor, there were 53 fashionable, well-dressed ladies of the town there. The next day, I arrived in Hartford, there was a dinner in my honor, there were 75 elegant, well-dressed ladies of the town there. Well, he was traveling with a very tiny entourage, and there's absolutely no doubt that the person who was doing the nightly head count of the ladies was the father of our country. I guess it was a kind of a nice distraction for him. Now, even in the privacy of Mount Vernon, George Washington remained a form of public property. Toward the end of the war, a friend of his said, look, you should go to Congress, you should get a special appropriation, you're going to have to do a lot of entertaining. Washington didn't listen. He was a very proud man, and he literally paid the price, because as soon as the war was over, hundreds and perhaps thousands of veterans, tourists, and curiosity seekers descend en masse on Mount Vernon. And Washington, who was an impeccably courteous man, feels obliged to feed them, to house them, to feed their horses. It's got very expensive. Remember, at the time, rural areas, roadways were not lined, with roadside hotels and on restaurants. On June 30th, 1785, in other words, a full year and a half after he'd returned from the war, Washington recorded this sad line in his diary, quote, dined with only Mrs. Washington, which I believe is the first instance of it since my retirement from public life. He'd been home a year and a half. It was the first time he'd had dinner with his wife. Now, I said earlier that Washington was not the cold and prudish figure of myth. In fact, I discovered he had a rather bawdy sense of humor. Nathaniel Hawthorne once complained mockingly that Washington, quote, was surely born with his clothes on and with his hair powdered and made a stately bow on his first appearance in the world. But trust me, there was nothing puritanical about Washington, and I'm not just referring to the famous infatuation with Sally Fairfax on the eve of his marriage to Martha. Washington had a friend named Colonel Joseph Ward, who remarried at the age of 47. Washington considered this a comically advanced age for marriage, and he wrote the following letter to a mutual friend, quote, I'm glad to hear that my old acquaintance Colonel Ward is yet under the influence of vigorous passions. He then went on to suppose that Ward, quote, like a prudent general, had reviewed his strength, his arms, and ammunition before he got involved in action. Let me advise him to make the first onset upon his fair lady with vigor, that the impression may be deep if it cannot be lasting or frequently renewed. Not a line you're likely to find in the current school textbooks, I think. Forgive me for doing that. Couldn't resist. Sorry, parents. The marriage to Martha, I don't know how romantic it was. It was certainly ripened into a very, very deep and productive friendship between these two people. The marriage to Martha gave Washington financial security. Martha was the richest widow in Virginia when they married, gave Washington emotional support. He was a rather reserved man who needed that special confidant and a social setting. Martha really had a gift, which I think George did not, in terms of greeting people, putting them at their ease. In short, it was really Martha Washington who gave her husband the warm, stable home life that he needed to accomplish his monumental tasks. It's always said in passing, Martha, would visit him in winter quarters during the Revolutionary War. Well, those winter visits invariably extended into the spring, and Martha Washington spent a full half of the Revolutionary War with her husband, despite constant jitters about being in a war zone. Every time a cannon went off, she would jump. Also, long before Michelle Obama had frustrations with the job, Martha found the job of First Lady a trial to be endured. This is what she wrote after 6 months on the job, quote, "I think I'm more like a state prisoner than anything else, and as I cannot do as I like, I am obstinate and stay at home a great deal." She said that she thought that a younger and more sociable woman would have enjoyed the job much more than she did, but she was kind of like George, a very stoic personality. Now, Martha Washington brought 2 children from her previous marriage to the marriage with George Washington. It's the reason, incidentally, Martha had children, grandchildren, and her great-granddaughter, Mary, married this gentleman, Mary Custis. So you see how I have woven together all the various strands of Washington and Lee history here. But George and Martha Washington had no children of their own because Martha had children from the previous marriage. It's suspected that George Washington may have been sterile. Now, the fact that they had no children of their own was a great source of sadness to them as a couple, but it was actually a godsend for Washington's career, because when he became president, many people were reassured by the fact that because he was childless, he would have no vested interest in starting hereditary monarchy. And many religiously minded people felt that God had deliberately prevented George Washington from becoming a biological father so that he could become instead the father of his country. Now, he also felt in writing about Washington that to flesh out the private man behind the public facade, that I also had to devote considerable space to Washington as a slaveholder. Earlier generations of biographers seemed to deem it a trivial fact that George Washington owned 300 human beings. Washington was deeply conflicted over the whole issue. He opposed slavery in theory, at least after the Revolutionary War, but he was never able to make it a public issue in practice, because even in the founding era, slavery was the most divisive issue, and Washington, as the embodiment of national unity, knew that he could only broach the subject at his peril. So I wanted to, write about Washington in a way where his slaves were not simply faceless names, but emerged as full-blooded human beings. To that end, I tried to bring to life, he had a wonderful valet named Billy Lee, who was an excellent rider and huntsman and raconteur, accompanied Washington every day during the Revolutionary War, where there was Ona Judge, who was Martha's favorite young slave, who was an excellent seamstress and who later escaped to freedom in New Hampshire. Now, what I love about George Washington was not that he was perfect. He was not. I loved your line about history being imperfect people in an imperfect world or something. That's a perfect description. But Washington was capable of constant growth and constant self-criticism. He was a man who was born into a world where slavery was both commonplace and unquestioned. But by the end of his life, in his will, he performed his single most visionary act. He became the only founder to free his slaves, at least those 125 slaves who were directly under his legal control. The remaining slaves were the so-called dower slaves that were legally pledged to the Custis descendants. Now, I feel like I've just begun to scratch the surface of an extraordinarily rich and eventful life, but I know no speech about George Washington should last as long as either the French and Indian War or the Revolutionary War. So I will simply thank you for the great honor of participating in this Founders Day convocation, and thank you so much for doing honor to me by inviting me, and much more by doing honor to the General. Thank you.